consider yourself a high achiever, smart, driven, highly successful? I am so excited to have you. My name is Julia Arndt, and I'm the host of the Stress Podcast. I will help you develop your stress resilience the same way you've developed your workplace superpowers. Learn peak performance tools to thrive at work and in your personal life. Let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Stress Podcast. I am very excited to welcome our next podcast guest to the show, and it is Sharon Grossman. Hi, Sharon. How are you today?
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited. I was just thinking when we hit the record button that it's funny that we both have kind of our microphones coming in from the side. But that's just what it is today. Sharon, I'm super excited to talk with you today about burnout, which is obviously my favorite topic to talk about on this podcast in order to help people better understand what burnout is and what they can do about it. So I'm super excited to have the official burnout doc, as you call yourself, on the podcast today. And I always start my podcast with 3 very simple questions. Number 1, where are you located? Number 2, what time is it? And number 3, what have you been up to before we jumped on the call today?
Oh, okay, well, those are easy questions. I think I'm going to pass the test.
Great.
I am calling in from Miami Beach.
Nice.
And it is 4 p.m. And I was just on a client call right before this. So we had a coaching session, and actually it went over a couple of minutes because we were just kind of wrapping things up. And it's always kind of exciting at the end when, you've spent the whole hour talking about stuff, and then you're like, okay, and then I want you to focus on this because this is really going to change your world, So that's what we were doing right before this.
Very nice. And how do you start your day?
So I feel very fortunate because as a business owner, I get to make my own schedule, which I think is like the greatest thing ever.
Yeah, I agree.
So what I do is I start by doing some exercise. So some days I'll go swimming, and other days I do some yoga. But regardless of what I'm doing, I make sure to get some outside light. So even if I'm going to stay home and do yoga in my living room, I go outside for a short walk just so I can get that sunlight in my eyes and get, the cortisol started and all the things that you need to wake you up in the morning. And then after that, it's usually a shower, and I'll do some meditation. And then I really kind of settle down into my desk and start working around 10 a.m. So I really give myself like 3 full hours in the morning to take care of my health and my mental health before I sit down and actually pound out some work.
Wow, that's really amazing. And so tell us a little bit more about you and how you got to become the Burnout Doc.
Yeah, so I actually started out as a psychologist, and I'd been doing that work for about 20 years. And somewhere along the way, I started to do some research on burnout. I find like that burnout is one of those topics where everybody's heard the term and it gets thrown around sometimes, but we don't always understand what it really means. And the more research I started to do, the more I would be able to identify it in my clients. So they would come in and they would describe what's going on for them. And what I realized is that a lot of them actually are describing burnout. And so I would say to them, oh, it sounds like you're burning out. And they'd have like that light bulb moment where all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, that's what's going on. So that happened with one section of the population, you could say. I think the other is that they kind of know that they're burned out and they just don't know what to do about it. And what I also found is that if you kind of Google burnout and what to do, there's a lot of really generic answers out there, which I understand, there's certain things that are going to help everybody, like recharge their batteries and relax and things like that. But I also think that what's really important is to take into consideration the person, because each of us has unique needs that we need to be able to address. And actually, what I find is that burnout typically happens when we don't get certain needs met. And so you have to not only recover, but then have some sort of a strategy for how you're going to get back in the game so that it doesn't happen again and again. Right. And so if we haven't learned anything from our experience, then we're basically at risk for having that repeat. And so what I've done is really put together all of my years of experience as a psychologist and understanding the person and all the like nuances that we bring to the table. And then I've brought it together with all of the research that I had done on burnout specifically and kind of married the two and really then pushed the envelope. And, you know, I started out by just writing my book, which basically takes a lot of that I was just explaining, you know, from psychology and from my experience as a clinician, and created like a 7-step process for people, which is really about how to live life successfully. But I really put it through the lens of burnout. So it's called the 7E solution to burnout. And usually when people read it, they find it very transformative and it gives them a lot of aha moments, you know, which is great. But then I thought, well, how can we go even further than this? How can we really personalize this process for people? And what even comes before burnout? Like, how do we know if we're even at risk? And that's where I really created this whole concept of decoding your burnout. And what I like to say is, you know, it's important for us to understand what brings each of us to the burnout table, if you will. Because once we understand that, we can kind of rewind and figure out what I need to do to get out of this specifically. So not only to recover, but also to prevent the recurrence. And then it becomes a very customizable approach to dealing with burnout. And so that's really what I'm here to share with your audience.
Very cool. Yeah. And I'm super excited to dive deeper into that. And my first question is, when clients come to you and, you know, you said you had these moments where you're like, oh, it all kind of sounds like burnout. What signals or signs that you identify are helpful, you know, points to know, oh, something is going on?
Really good question. And your podcast is about stress. So you're very familiar with stress. And that's another one of those things that we throw around a lot. But I also think it's important, even when we think we know something, to define it so that we're all on the same page. And stress has been defined in a number of different ways in the research. One of the kind of definitions that I like to go with is when the demands on you exceed your resources. So if you think about it, if you and I have to do this recording right now, but one of us is feeling really tired because we didn't sleep the night before, or we're really stressed out because we've got a deadline coming up, then when we show up to do this, we're going to be feeling very stressed. Right? And it's not necessarily that this is very stressful per se. It's just kind of our state, given everything that's going on around us. And different things can stress people out, right? We know that. We know for some people it's like physiologically because I'm just tired. Like I just haven't gotten enough rest, or I'm not eating really good food and I don't feel good, right? Or I'm having marital problems. Like, you know, my husband and I aren't getting along and I just feel it. Or like my kids are driving me crazy, you know, or whatever. I work in a toxic culture. Or my job is super demanding. Like so many different things stress us out. And what burnout is, to differentiate from just what we call stress, is, you know, when we talk about, oh, you know, it was really stressful getting here this morning because there's a lot of traffic, that's acute stress. And when we talk about burnout, we're really talking about chronic stress. Right. And that's a big differentiator for people. So when people talk about burnout, it's really about like, listen, it's Groundhog's Day. Like every single day, I've got to go to work and I got to deal with the same people and the same demands. And it's just a total grind. When you have that happening again and again, what you're going to start to notice is the first thing, most likely, is that you're going to just feel mentally and emotionally drained. That even if you got a good night's sleep, you don't feel rested, it's hard for you to focus, your productivity starts to go down. And then as a result of that, you might start questioning your ability. So it affects your confidence. And then your attitude gets really negative. So either you become kind of cynical, or what I find more often than not that's less talked about is just people become very resentful, and they're kind of stuck in this state of anger and bitterness.
Yeah.
So all of those, if that's something that, you know, somebody listening to this, if you're feeling that, that could be a sign that you're burned out. Right. And so then what I like to do is then take you on this journey to figure out what got you here, and what do you need to do to make sure that you get out of it. And it's not like, hey, go meditate, because that's not for everybody, and it doesn't solve all problems. Not to say that meditation isn't fantastic, but it's not, it's, you know, burnout recovery is not a one size fits all. You really have to customize. That's kind of my take on it. And it's the same with anything, really. Like when we do therapy, right? We don't say, oh, if you have this problem, everybody with this problem should all do this. It's like, exactly. No, right? Even a physician, you know, if I have a headache and you have a headache, they have to ask some other questions, because it's not like, oh, then just take a Tylenol and everything's going to be great. Like maybe my head hurts and it's a migraine, and you're not going to know that until you ask me some more questions. And maybe mine is brought on by stress and yours is brought on because you're dehydrated. Right. So for me, I need to relax and you need to drink more water. And so that's how I approach burnout.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I know that once you know, identify those early warning signals or the signs that people are burned out, then you go deeper, right? And then what I love, you are saying it like you're decoding burnout. What different profiles do you differentiate between?
Yeah. So when we decode, we're really looking at 3 different factors. One is your programming, and that comes down to all of the beliefs that you have downloaded from conditions when you were growing up. So when you were in certain situations, you kind of absorb things like a sponge. Your brain tries to make sense of your experiences. And so you download these ideas, or like the meanings and the interpretations, and that becomes your lens through which you see the world. And what happens is we don't really question that. It becomes our truth. We don't even realize that it's subjective and that it's not necessarily the truth. And so it's really an opportunity, once you uncover what that is, to start asking better questions and saying, like, is that really still the case? Is that serving me? Like, what else could I maybe think about? Or what, you know, what else is true that I'm ignoring, right? There's some other questions there. So it's really, really important to understand what is the programming that you bring forward, right? Because as an example, and we'll talk about this when we get to the third factor, but a lot of times we have these notions that maybe were modeled for us by our parents. So a lot of times the people that I speak with who are super high achievers and they've burned out, they'll talk about things like work ethic, something that my parents really believed in and demonstrated. And so I grew up seeing how important that is. And so I knew I had to show up and I had to do whatever it took to be successful and get to the top and this and that. And it's not a very balanced model of the world, because it's so one-sided. It's just like, yeah, work hard, get there. But it's like, well, what about you as a person? What about your body that has to carry you on that journey? And what about your mind? And what about your relationships? And what about all these other aspects of your life that you're like ignoring and putting on the back burner because you're now focused on this one thing, right? We're not talking about that enough. And so people are like so programmed to just go, 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 that they're letting all these other things slide. And we get into trouble when we do that. So that's just as an example of what I mean by that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I was just thinking about when you were saying that is that sometimes when we have this experience of, that experience from our parents, it's also that we didn't really question that success path, right? I think we go to to school, and we go to college, and we learn, and we are just kind of following this path because our parents have modeled that. And then oftentimes I find as well that then clients are in in jobs that they're not maybe super passionate about. They're just there because that was kind of the right thing to do, right? It was like the big paying job, or the really interesting company that everybody knows. But is it really what you want to do? And is that really aligned with your passions and your beliefs?
Yeah, that's a perfect example of how we get programmed to do certain things without questioning it, right? Because we don't question those things. If it's part of your programming, it's just like how it shapes your brain to think. And so it becomes automated and it goes into your subconscious. And so it's like we're on autopilot at that point. And only when you go through these kinds of processes does it bring it up to the surface and you're like, oh, right. Like I didn't actually realize that's what's driving the whole mechanism here. So that's important. Second factor is the thing that we're typically most aware of, which is our environmental stressors. But we sometimes don't do math where we're not adding up all of the things. We're like, yeah, I know my work is really stressful, but we don't realize that it's not just work, but maybe it's the fact that you're lonely because you're not in a relationship, or you just broke up with somebody, or because you're having some issues with a family member, or your health is deteriorating, or you've gained a bunch of weight and you're really trying to lose it, but you're struggling, or 100 other things. And add up all the things that we face as human beings. Work is just one piece of that puzzle, but all of those things together contribute to your whole wellness. And therefore, oftentimes when it's stress here and stress there and stress everywhere, it creates this like lack of wellness because so much of it is deteriorating from your well-being. So being aware of all the stressors that you are dealing with, and then really figuring out how to mitigate that, and how to what can you do? What do you have control over? What kind of things can you do to change that? Really being strategic is going to be really helpful there. And then ultimately, to answer the question that you really asked, we look at the third factor, which is your personality or your burnout profile. And I've broken this down into 3 different profiles. And so as I describe these, I'm going to ask your listeners to really think about which one of these descriptions fits you the most, and know that you can be more than one. And then we'll talk about what that means after we go through it. So I've broken this down into thinkers, feelers, and doers. And so step 1 of this process is to really discover which of these profiles fits you best. So listen to this description. So thinkers are people who go through a mental obstacle course of perfectionism, self-criticism, indecisiveness, imposter syndrome, catastrophizing. So notice these are all things that we overthink in our brain, right? And all of this creates a lot of unnecessary anxiety, which depletes you of energy and then contributes to burnout, right? So you're really in your head and you can't turn it off. It's like a constant thing. Feelers burn out because they end up focusing on other people. They want to please. And so they take on more than they can chew. They become so overwhelmed in the process that they collapse. And they're so filled with guilt about saying no to other people or saying yes to themselves, because then they're like, well, all these other people really need me, and I shouldn't really do something for myself because then I'll feel guilty, But when they do say yes, then they're resentful. There's that word again. Right? Because it's like, I do all this stuff for everybody else. Nobody seems to do anything for me. What about me? And they end up feeling really trapped and emotionally exhausted no matter what they do. And then you have the doers who burn out because they just try to do too much. So some examples that really illustrate this are, imagine you are starting a new business and you're pregnant, right? Or you work for, some company and you're working 70 hours or more a week, but you're also trying to raise kids at the same time. And one of your kids happens to have special needs, and then you get a puppy on top of it all. Right? And these are like true stories of like people that I've talked to. Okay. So whereas the thinker really has this idea of whatever I do isn't good enough because they're looking at quality, the doer feels like nothing I do is enough because they're focused on quantity. So it's always about doing more. Okay. So kind of figure out where you fit in within those three. And as I said, it could be more than one. Step two is then identify what are the beliefs. So this comes back to your programming. What are the beliefs that have shaped your personality that continue to drive your actions? So thinkers tend to worry about things going wrong. They want to stay on top of their work, right? So they focus on quality. As we said, they believe that what they do is not good enough. And if something good does happen, maybe because I've put so much effort in, right? Then the idea is it's not going to last. So it's kind of like that very negative, anxiety ridden way of catastrophizing and never really settling in your mind, no matter how good you have it, because the other shoe is going to drop where you're just waiting for it, so you can't actually celebrate. You can't actually be like, yay, I've worked so hard and I got it, that's awesome. Like you can't ever do that because it's like, oh, because as soon as I celebrate, what's going to happen, some catastrophe is going to fall out of the sky, and we don't want that. So I have to be hyper vigilant. Okay. And then for feelers, it's really about believing that other people's needs are more important than your own, which then leads you to prioritize them over you. So that's pretty straightforward. And then for doers, doers equate their value with their productivity. They end up focusing on quantity, as I said, and getting a lot of things done. But because they believe that nothing they do is ever enough, they work until they physically cannot work anymore as a result of burnout. And so we've heard of people who literally have been hospitalized multiple times because they keep driving. And I literally talked to a guy who was in the hospital and working from his hospital bed.
Wow.
I mean, these are people who are driven, right? So, and you have to ask yourself, why would we do this? And it really does come back to that subconscious programming, right? It's like, it's so in us that we don't even realize what we're doing and why we're doing it. And then from there, we really want to talk about your recovery strategy. And it's really important to go through those first two steps because that's going to inform what you should focus on. Right? So if you're a thinker, you might focus on things like letting go of the need to control, overcoming the fear of failure, increasing your own self-compassion, trusting your instincts to make a decision so that you're not stuck in that indecisiveness, right? And then really grounding yourself to feel safe rather than anxious. So those are all things that get you out of your head, get you nice and grounded and in your body. So that's really the idea there. Feelers have to focus on creating boundaries and shifting their belief about their importance and really identifying their needs, because they end up being unmet, and really meeting those needs is important. And on managing their emotions and understanding how their actions really feed into the guilt and the resentment, so that if you could change that around, then you don't have to feel that way anymore, right? And then for doers, you might be focused on things like that limiting belief about your self-worth that tells you you're only worthy if you keep producing things, right? And then it's about cutting back on your hours and slowing down and taking time off or taking breaks throughout your day and really to tune in to yourself rather than constantly be focused externally on things like your to-do lists. Okay. So really, as you can see, each type needs to get to a state of balance based on what's making them lopsided to begin with.
Yeah, I love that. Wow. I don't think ever someone has explained that so well in terms of more like profiles almost, right? So thank you. Thank you so much
You're
for sharing that
welcome.
with me. Yeah, and with us. That's super helpful. One question that came up for me as you were talking about all of this was, do you think that burnout is ultimately self-imposed?
I don't think it's a clear-cut yes or no. As I said, there's like these 3 different contributing factors. And if we look at those 3 to answer your question, the programming is not your fault, but it doesn't mean there's nothing you can do about it. Your environmental stressors are not your fault because those are things outside of you, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing you can do about it. Right? There's some things that are in your control and some things that aren't, but it's really about focusing on what you have control over. And there are usually things that you can do. And ultimately it's, that profile, that personality, which is very much shaped by your beliefs, which then dictates your emotional state and your behaviors and habits and patterns and things like that. And again, the reason I come on to shows like yours and talk about this is because it really starts from a place of mindfulness and self-awareness. And the more you understand yourself and what is driving that mechanism for you, the more you're like, oh, okay, well, maybe through that description, I recognize that I'm a thinker, right? Like I'm a perfectionist and I tend to take a long time doing things, or I tend to procrastinate, or I overthink everything. And I don't know how to turn work off. And so I feel really stressed, and that's why I'm burned out. And it's really hard for me to sleep. So I'm exhausted. Like all of these things contribute. So maybe that's you. And if that's you, and that's as far as you've gotten in this process, and you don't know what else to do except the fact that you've identified it, then that's a win already, because
Huge. Yeah.
now with that self-awareness, you can have like a targeted strategy. You're like, okay, well, I know that one of the things that contributes is the fact that I'm a perfectionist. So maybe I target that. Or maybe it's the fact that what's causing me to be a perfectionist is my belief that I have to do the best work, because if I don't, fill in the blank, right? So identifying what the belief is that drives that whole mechanism is like the next level win. And then once I identify what that is, then I think about like, what can I do to change that belief? And now we have something, right? And so I think it's important to really be very, very clear on what is not just like the symptoms, because we're not in the business of treating symptoms. We're in the business of helping people transform their lives, and transformation is a result from having a true understanding of the underlying mechanisms. And if you can understand that, even if you don't know what to do about it, then at least you're like, okay, well, now I can look for outside help. That's where I maybe read a book, or I take a course, or I work with a coach, or I go into therapy, or I do something that helps me target the specific thing that I need to work on in order to get out of this pattern.
Yeah. And one thing that I was just thinking is, when you are the thinker and when you're tending to be perfectionist, which I think a lot of high achievers are, is that, you think you need to do it all in order to resolve burnout, but progress is progress. Like, even if you just tackle one thing, and you should just tackle one thing at a time, or like keep it really small in order to just see that progress. And that over time will also add up to, making you feel better and getting out of maybe that burnout that you're experiencing right now.
100%. Yeah. So it's really about one step at a time. And by the way, like one of the things that I really champion is having a blueprint from somebody who is really ahead of you, who's been there, who understands, who's an expert, or who's already gone through that journey, just something that works for you, not to have to reinvent the wheel, right? So, and we do this all the time, where we'll go to a physician when let's say we've injured our foot and we don't know what to do. It's like, well, this person went to med school. I don't need to like go on Google and figure this out. Like, I go to the experts so they can diagnose and treat, right? And I think we don't do that enough for things that are emotional and things that are mental. We're really it's more, I think, acceptable in our society to do it for your physical body, but I think we need it just as much, if not more, for all of these other things, and burnout is no exception.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love that you're saying that. I totally agree. And so, okay, so, one thing that I want to say as well is it's very interesting when you talked about these 3 different profiles, because I'm definitely like, yep, number 1, I'm a thinker and I'm also a doer. And I think the combination of the two of the things are what brought me to burnout in the past. Obviously, now I'm aware of a million different tools. So I try to incorporate that on a day-to-day basis, because I still tend to do these things, right? I still tend to put my plate full of things, and I like to do it. I feel accomplished when I do it, right? And when I get the things done that I set out to do, or when I'm, from a thinking perspective, I think I always question. I think especially as a business owner as well, right? You're always wondering, is that enough that I'm doing? And then you're looking left and right, and you see other people do other things really in an amazing way. And I think this comparison piece is such a life changer as well, in one or the other direction. So all of the things that you said deeply resonate, and I'm super glad that you explained that in such a clear and easy way, because it's not that complicated at the end of the day, right?
It really isn't. But when somebody comes in and has some sort of a blueprint for you, it helps you to then identify where you fall, and it helps you to frame things in a way that is simplified. And I think that's probably one of my superpowers, is being able to simplify concepts for people and help them to get to that place of clarity really quickly, so that they can then, because I mean, that's always the first step, is understanding what's going on for you.
Yeah, for sure. And as a psychologist, do you still believe in kind of the traditional, we're sitting down and we're talking about these things in order to get you out of there? And then what is your approach with that? Do you say we need, like, sometimes I have one session with a client and they're like super hyper aware then, and then they just run with it? Or is there kind of like a process as well involved that you like to take?
Well, so I don't do therapy anymore,
Okay.
but I do believe there's a place for therapy. And I also think that if you're going to go down that rabbit hole, that you need to be an educated consumer, because it's not like all therapy is the same. And so depending on what your struggle is, there's different therapies that can be helpful. So the more you understand about what is the best therapy for what I'm currently dealing with, and really getting like really good information on that, that's going to help you make the right decision. And I definitely think there's a place for therapy. And I say, if for anything in particular, for the most chronic of situations, it is very, very needed. So personality disorders, it's really hard to treat, but there's really nothing else out there. I think for things like depression and anxiety, it's definitely helpful. And most of all, for trauma, super, super important, but also that you get the right kind of trauma therapy, not just like a generic talk therapy. Okay, so that's kind of my caveat. And what I do now is really burnout focused coaching. So I help people who are burned out for a variety of reasons recover and really learn the skills that they need to be successful moving forward, so that they can change what they have control over, which is themselves, in terms of the way that they think, and really create the kinds of emotions that they want on purpose, because our thoughts are very much connected to our feelings. And sometimes we focus too much, I think, on behavior, and it's really hard to change your behaviors if you're in a certain emotional state. And in order to change your emotional state, you have to manage your thoughts. And so we do a lot of that sort of work, but also some other kinds of things that help with work engagement, that help with your confidence, that help you feel more empowered, that help you be more mindful. I mean, there's, time management from all different perspectives. But I would say if I had to narrow it down to the number one thing to help people who are burned out figure out how to be more successful in the world, I would say it's emotional intelligence, hands down.
Interesting. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, very simply, emotional intelligence is where you are both aware and are able to adequately manage your own emotions. And as I just said, if your emotions are a product of your thoughts, the more you're aware of those automatic thoughts that are part of your programming, which is why you don't even stop to think about it and you don't even recognize that you're having it, the more we can slow everything down and say, okay, this is really the thought that's going on. When I think this, it makes me feel resentful, or it makes me feel frustrated, or it makes me feel guilty, or whatever the negative emotion is, or I feel really stressed, right? Whatever it is, then we want to look at that thought. That thought leads to this emotion. What is it about that thought? Maybe it's not true. And if it's not true, then what is more true? Or maybe it's true, but it's not really helpful. So we want to look at what would be even more helpful. Or we can reverse engineer the whole process and ask, how do you want to feel in this situation? So that's your environmental stressor, let's say. That's your circumstance. Those are the facts. We're not going to change it. Let's say there's a situation you can't change. So then the question is, how do you want to feel given the fact that this is what's going on right now in the world or in your world? I did this a lot during COVID with people because people were super anxious, a lot of catastrophizing going on, very stressed, very depressed, all this stuff. And I'm like, we're not going to make COVID go away. We don't have control over that. But what you do have control over is what goes on in your mind. So let's identify the thought and let's ask you, like, how do you want to feel given everything that's going on right now? And the answer that comes back usually is calm. I want to feel calm. I want to be at peace. Right? Like, yes, all this stuff is going on outside. I don't have control over it. And I tend to freak out a lot. But really what I want is I just want some peace. Like, okay, well, what would it take for you to feel peaceful? What would you have to think about COVID and the fact that it's here in order for you to feel at peace? And then they would fill in the blank and they would say, oh, well, the fact that I still have a roof over my head and I have a job and I've got money coming in, or whatever, they would start to reframe the situation. And that's the kind of thing that sounds really simple.
So simple, yeah.
But if it was really that simple, people would be doing it already.
Sure.
So a lot of times we actually need somebody to take us through it because we don't know what we don't know. We're so kind of in our own blind spots. And a lot of times we're just stuck because our brain has a tendency of thinking in a certain way. And that's the way it's always thought. So it's hard for us to start thinking about things in a new way, especially when we're stuck in that emotional state of resentment and anger and frustration. Like, but we're focusing on too much on like what other people should do or how things should be different, or it's like, well, how do you expect me to feel different given the fact that this is happening, right? So we have to break it all down. We have to like really look at how to effectively change how you feel, so that's going to then change how you show up. Right. And that's very empowering. That's why I love it so much.
Yeah, same. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that just kind of reminded me again, as you were saying all of these things as well, is that everything is so interconnected, right? Because then you overthink, you sleep not well, and then you go into the day and you feel more tired and you feel more like there's pressure on you. And, and you're having more negative thoughts and you're not getting all of the things done because you can't focus actually as well as you were used to maybe in the past. And so it's just kind of this like getting worse and worse, and where really that chronic stress comes in and just gets worse and worse over time.
Yeah. So it's just like anything else. The more you spiral in negativity, the more you spiral in negativity. Like it doesn't land you anywhere good. So you have to figure out how to unspiral yourself. And takes a lot of that self-awareness in order to even start the process.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Sharon, how can people best connect with you if they're curious to work with you?
Sure. Well, I know we've talked about a lot of things related to burnout, and it might just kind of get people starting to think about what's going on for them. And what I want to say is, if you are intrigued and you want to maybe talk to me about that blueprint that we were mentioning and kind of what would be the steps really customized for me, given what's going on in my situation, then I want to invite your guests to sign up for a complimentary session with me. They can go to book a chat with Sharon.com, and I'm going to open it up to 10 people. So if they're interested, it's absolutely complimentary to them. And we just get on a call and we talk exactly about what's going on, what my recommendations for them would be. There's no charge for that. And then if they really decide like it's a good fit and I'm happy to share kind of how I can help them, then they can decide if that's something they want to move forward with or not.
Yeah, perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us today. It was such a pleasure to hear a little bit more about your blueprint and your frameworks, because I think it's a really easy way to understand something maybe more complex or something that's sometimes feels so unapproachable. So thank you so much for that. And listener and peak performer, if you're listening to this right now and you might not 100% identify with one of the things, however, you were just thinking of someone that is really meeting this description, then make sure that you're sharing this podcast with them and help them to understand that there are so many different ways on how they can help themselves. And that's all I wanted to share with you today. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much again, Sharon. I wish you a wonderful rest of your day, and I hope to hear you again next week.
Thank you so much, Julia, for having me and for this amazing podcast that you've put together. And I understand you're approaching the 200th episode.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, it's very exciting.
Congratulations. That's fantastic.
Thank you so much, Sharon.